Colonel Brock Hessler tore the qualification sheet in half before Elise Thorne had even fired a single round. He held the two pieces up so the whole formation could see them, and he smiled. This, he said, is what happens to people who don't belong here. You're a headline sergeant, a photo op. Somebody in Washington needed a woman on a poster and they picked you. He let the paper fall into the mud at her boots. Target 17 has beaten 40 years of real soldiers. It will not be beaten by you. Before we go on, if a story about proving the impossible means something to you, take 1 second to subscribe. Follow this all the way to the end and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read every one and I love seeing how far this story travels. Part 1. Elise Thorne did not pick up the torn paper. That was the first thing the other candidates noticed about her, and later when the whole thing became legend, it was the first thing they remembered. 20 men stood in that formation at Fort Benning, Georgia, and every single one of them had flinched when the colonel ripped that sheet. She had not. She stood at the position of attention with rain running off the brim of her cover, and she looked straight through Brock Hessler as if he were made of glass. "You have nothing to say, Sergeant?" Hessler asked. "No excuse, Colonel," she said. "That's not what I asked. I have nothing to say that would change your mind, sir. So I'll save my breath for the range." A ripple went through the formation. Not laughter. Nobody was foolish enough to laugh at Hessler. But something moved through those 20 men, a kind of electricity, the feeling you get right before the first crack of thunder when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Hessler stepped closer to her. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of granite by somebody in a hurry. 22 years in special operations, a chest full of ribbons, a reputation that arrived in a room 3 minutes before he did. And he leaned down until his face was 6 inches from hers, and he said quietly, so only the front rank could hear, "You will quit. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but you will quit, and when you do, I want you to remember that I told you so on the very first morning." "I'll remember every word, sir," Elise said. "I promise you that." She meant it. That was the thing about Elise Thorne that Brock Hessler did not understand yet and would not understand for a long time. When she made a promise, she kept it. Her father had raised her that way up in the mountains of Montana in a cabin so far from the nearest town that the school bus didn't run out there and the mail came twice a week if the road was passable. Her father had taught her that a person is only as good as the last promise they kept, and that the whole world runs on trust, and that trust is a thing you build one kept word at a time. Her father was dead now, 8 months in the ground, and his last words to her, spoken from a hospital bed with tubes in his arms and the machines beeping, their slow countdown, had been a request that she had not been able to refuse. "Become the sniper I never could be." He had been a marksman, a real one, the kind of shooter that older men in the county still talked about in low, reverent voices at the feed store. But he had never worn a uniform. A bad knee, a heart murmur, a birthday that came too late for one war and too early for the next. He had spent 40 years shooting at paper and steel and never once at anything that mattered, and it had eaten at him quietly the way rust eats at iron, from the inside out where nobody can see it until the whole thing gives way. So he had poured everything into her, every trick, every secret, every hard-won piece of knowledge that a man accumulates when he spends 4 decades doing one thing better than almost anybody alive. And now she was standing in the rain at Fort Benning, and a colonel with a granite jaw was telling her she would quit. She would not quit. The first day of the course was called zeroing, which meant establishing the relationship between a rifle and the person who fires it. Every shooter and every weapon has to learn to speak the same language, and the process is slow and precise and quiet. Elise loved it. She had been doing it since she was 7 years old. She drew a rifle from the armory, checked the serial number against her paperwork twice, and carried it to the line. She settled behind it. She built her position the way her father had taught her, bone on bone, no muscle fighting the weight, breathing slow, the world narrowing down to the space between her eye and the target 300 meters away. She fired 3 rounds, she looked through the spotting scope, and she frowned. The rounds were low and left, consistently. A tight little group, 3 holes you could cover with a quarter, but sitting exactly where they should not be sitting. That was not a shooting error. 3 rounds that tight, all in the same wrong place, that was a mechanical problem. That was the rifle itself telling her that something inside it had been changed. She racked the bolt. She adjusted her turrets. She fired 3 more. Same place. Low and left. She sat up. She looked at the rifle in her hands as if it had spoken to her in a language she did not expect to hear. Marcus Webb was watching her from 20 feet away. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, the senior instructor, a wiry man of about 40, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had been watching all 20 candidates all morning, and he had a clipboard, and he made notes in small, precise handwriting, and he had not said a single word to anyone. But he had seen her frown, he had seen her sit up, and he walked over. "Problem, Sergeant?" he asked. "My groups are good, Sergeant," she said. "My 0 is wrong. Those 2 things don't usually go together." "No," she said, "they don't." Webb crouched down beside the rifle. He did not touch it. He just looked at it, at the turrets, at the way the numbers on the dial sat. And Elise watched his face, and she saw something flicker across it, some small recognition that came and went so fast she almost missed it. "You drew this weapon this morning?" Webb asked. 20 minutes ago, from the armory. I checked the serial twice. And it was zeroed for the last shooter, presumably. But you'd re-zero anyway." "I would, and I did. And my turrets are set right. But the rounds don't go where the turrets say they should." She paused. "Somebody moved the reticle inside the scope, Sergeant. Not the dials. The glass itself. Somebody took the top off this optic and shifted the internal adjustment and then put the dials back to 0 so it would look untouched." Webb was quiet for a moment. "That's a serious thing to say," he said finally. "It's a serious thing to do," she answered. And here is what Marcus Webb did not tell her that first day, standing in the rain by the firing line. He did not tell her that he had seen Brock Hessler come into the armory the night before. He did not tell her that he had thought it was strange a colonel in the armory at 10 o'clock at night, when colonels do not clean weapons and do not draw weapons and have absolutely no reason to be alone in a room full of scopes. He had thought it was strange, and then he had told himself it was none of his business, and he had gone home. He did not tell her any of that. Not yet. What he said was, "Draw a different weapon, and this time when you sign it out, write down the serial number in your own notebook, not just the official log. Your own notebook. You understand me?" She looked at him, and something passed between them, some quiet understanding, the recognition of one careful person by another. "Yes, Sergeant," she said. "I understand you exactly." She drew a second rifle. She wrote the serial in her own notebook in her father's careful block printing, which she had learned from watching him fill out ballistics logs at the kitchen table by lamplight. She carried the new rifle to the line. She zeroed it in 9 rounds. Tight, centered, perfect. And down at the far end of the range in the shelter of the tower, Colonel Brock Hessler lowered his binoculars and did not say anything at all. That night in the barracks, a young private named Caldwell could not stop his hands from shaking. Nobody knew why. He wouldn't say. But Elise had been watching him during the day's stalking instruction, and she had seen it. The kid was drowning. Not physically. He was strong enough, fast enough, fit enough. But every time the instructors talked about moving unseen, about lying still for hours, about the silent patient work of the stalk, something in his face went white and tight, and his breath came fast, and his hands trembled like leaves in a wind. She found him sitting on the floor of the latrine at 11 o'clock at night, his back against the tile, his knees pulled up to his chest. "You're going to fail the stalk," she said. It was not unkind. It was just true, and they both knew it. "I know," he said. "You want to tell me we am on Alhas." He didn't answer for a long time. And then in a voice so small she had to lean in to hear it, he said, "When I was 9, my brother and me got lost hunting. In the dark. In the deep woods. And we had to lie still and quiet all night because there was a bear, and I thought we were going to do, and I've never been able to lie still and quiet in the dark since. My chest just closes up. I can't breathe." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, and he was 19 years old and terrified. "They're going to wash me out. And my dad, he was infantry, and his dad was infantry. And if I wash out of this, I don't know how I ever go home again." Elise sat down on the floor beside him. Cold tile against her back. 11 o'clock at night, a course that could destroy her if she was caught helping another candidate. She helped him anyway. "My daddy taught me something," she said. "When you were 9 lying in the dark, the stillness was the enemy. It was the thing that trapped you. So your body decided stillness means danger, and now every time you have to be still, your body sounds the alarm. She looked at him. We're going to teach your body a new story. Stillness isn't the trap, Caldwell. Stillness is the shield. When you're still, they can't find you. When you're still, you're safe. The movement is the danger. You've got it backwards, and we're going to turn it around. How? Slow, starting tonight, right here. You're going to lie down on this floor, and you're going to be still, and I'm going to be right here the whole time, and nothing is going to find you. And we'll do it for 1 minute, and tomorrow too, and by the time we get to the field, you're going to be the stillest man in Sector 9. He looked at her like she had thrown him a rope across a canyon. Why would you do this? He asked. You could get thrown out. Everybody says the colonel is looking for any reason. And Elise Thorne said something then that Caldwell would carry with him for the rest of his life through 2 deployments and a Silver Star and a career he never once believed he'd have. Because somebody did it for my daddy once, she said, a long time ago, and he did it for me every single day of my life. And the only way you ever pay back a debt like that is you pass it forward to the next person drowning on a cold floor at 11 o'clock at night. She stood up and held out her hand. Now get down on the deck, Private. We've got work to do. What neither of them knew was that Brock Hessler kept a duty roster of who was awake and where every hour of every night, and that a nervous private had mentioned to a sergeant that Sergeant Thorne had been in the latrine a long time and that the machine of Hessler's suspicion had already begun quietly to turn. The next morning, Hessler called Elise into his office. He did not offer her a seat. He let her stand at attention in front of his desk while he read a folder, slowly turning each page, making her wait. It was an old trick. She had seen her father use it on nervous young men who came to buy rifles they couldn't afford. Make them wait. Let the silence do the work. She was not nervous. She waited. You were up half the night, Hessler said finally, not looking up, fraternizing with another candidate, coaching him, which is prohibited. I was using the latrine, sir, for an hour and 10 minutes. I had a stomach issue, sir. The chow doesn't agree with me. Hessler looked up at her, and they stared at each other across the desk, and both of them knew exactly what the truth was, and both of them knew the other one knew, and neither of them was going to say it out loud. Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant Thorne, Hessler said. He stood up. He walked around the desk. You are going to fail this course. I have decided this. Not because you can't shoot. I've seen your file. I know you can shoot. You'll fail this course because I run this course, and I do not want you in my army wearing that qualification, and there is nothing you can do about it, because I hold every card and you hold none. He leaned against the desk, arms folded. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand what you're telling me, sir, Elise said. I don't believe it. You don't believe it? No, sir, because you left one thing out of your math. And what's that? She looked at him with those steady mountain eyes and she said, You're counting on me caring what you think. And I don't. My father spent 40 years wanting to be told that he was good enough by men like you. And he died before he ever heard it. And I watched what that wanting did to him, sir. It hollowed him out. So a long time ago, I made myself a promise that I would never ever put my worth in the hands of a man who'd already decided to break me. You can fail me. You've got the power. But you can't make me quit, and you can't make me small, and you cannot make me care what you think of me. That's the one card you'll never hold. The office was very quiet, and then Hessler smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has just decided that a fight he expected to be easy is going to be much more interesting than he thought. Dismissed, he said. She turned to go. Sergeant Thorne, he said when her hand was on the door. She stopped. That rifle yesterday, the one with the bad zero. Real shame about that. Equipment fails sometimes. You should be more careful about the gear you draw. She did not turn around. She stood there with her hand on the door and she said quietly, I write down every serial number now, sir, in my own notebook, in my father's handwriting. So I always know exactly which weapon I had and exactly when and exactly what was done to it. A pause, just in case anybody ever asks. And then she opened the door and walked out and left Colonel Brock Hessler standing in his office with the smile slowly draining off his face. Because a man who is cheating cannot stand the thought of a written record. For the next several days, the war between them went underground. It happened in 1,000 small ways that never showed up on any official paperwork. Elise would find her assigned firing position moved to the worst spot on the line into the sun, into the wind, into the glare. She would say nothing and outshoot everyone anyway. Her range time would be scheduled during the hottest hour of the day, and the coolest hour would go to the candidates Hessler favored. She would say nothing and outshoot them anyway. She was assigned every dirty detail, every extra duty given the least sleep and the most work, and she would say nothing and show up the next morning, steady as stone, and outshoot them anyway. And every day Marcus Webb watched. He watched and he wrote it down. Not the shooting. Everybody could see the shooting. He wrote down the other things, the move positions, the bad time slots, the extra duties, the pattern of it, because Marcus Webb had been in the Army for 22 years and he knew the difference between a candidate being tested and a candidate being hunted, and what he was watching was a hunt. One evening he found her cleaning her rifle alone long after everyone else had gone to chow. "You know he's watching every move you make," Webb said, "waiting for you to slip. One disciplinary write-up and you're gone. You don't even have to fail the shooting. You just have to give him one excuse." "I know," she said, running an oiled patch down the bore. "Then why help the Caldwell kid? Why take the risk? You could keep your head down, do your time, shoot your qualification. Walk out of here clean." She thought about that for a moment, and then she said something that Webb wrote down that night word for word in the notebook he was keeping, the one he never showed anybody. "My daddy told me there are two kinds of shooters," she said. "There's the kind who shoots to prove he's better than everybody else. And there's the kind who shoots because somewhere out there is a person who's going to need him to be steady when everything's falling apart. The first kind is about him. The second kind is about them." She held the rifle up to the light and looked down the clean bore. "The first kind wins medals. The second kind is who you want on the mountain with you when the sun goes down." She lowered the rifle. "I'm the second kind, Sergeant, and so was my daddy. And I'm not going to become the first kind just because a colonel with a grudge is trying to scare it out of me. I'd rather fail as the person my father raised than pass as somebody he wouldn't recognize." Marcus Webb looked at her for a long moment. "Your father," he said. "Thorne, Montana. That's not a common name for a shooter." He tilted his head. "There was a man years ago before your time, before mine, really. A civilian. Set records at a couple of the big matches that nobody's touched since. They called him the ghost of the high country because nobody could ever beat his cold bore shot. Old Man Thorne." Elise went very still. "That was my father," she said quietly. "I'll be damned," Webb said softly. "I shot against a man who shot against him once. Heard the stories." He looked at her with new eyes. "The ghost of the high country never made it into the service. Bum knee, they said. Broke his heart the way I heard it." "It did," she said, and her voice was steady but only just. "It broke his heart every single day for 40 years. And then it stopped his heart 8 months ago, and I held his hand while it did. And the last thing he asked me was to be the sniper he never got to be." She looked up at Webb, and her eyes were wet, but she did not let a single tear fall. "So when a colonel tells me I don't belong here, Sergeant Webb, he's not just insulting me. He's insulting a dead man who is better than any shooter this base has ever produced and who never got the chance to prove it. And I will crawl through fire before I let that stand." Marcus Webb had been a hard man for a long time, but something moved in his chest then, something he had thought was long since scarred over, and he made a decision. "Sergeant Thorne," he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to keep it to yourself." He lowered his voice. "That first rifle, the one with the bad zero, I saw Colonel Hessler in the armory the night before you drew it, alone, 10 o'clock at night. No reason on God's earth for him to be there." He paused. "I've been keeping notes on everything, the moved positions, the bad time slots, all of it. And I've got the armory access log, which shows exactly who signed in and out and when." He looked at her steadily. "I can't make him stop. He outranks me by a country mile. But I can make sure that if this ever goes in front of somebody who matters, there's a record, a real one, in my handwriting, that nobody can tear in half." Elise looked at him, and for the first time since she had arrived at Fort Benning, her composure cracked just a little, just for a second. "Why?" she asked. "You don't owe me anything." "No," Webb said, "but I owe the Army something. And what he's doing to you is a crime against the thing I've given my whole life to. The uniform isn't supposed to be a club for men like Hessler to keep people out of. It's supposed to be earned. You're earning it. He's stealing it from you. And I've spent 22 years watching men steal things that other people earned, and I'm tired of it. And this is where I stop watching and start doing something. He put out his hand. So, partners, then, you shoot. I'll keep the record, and we'll see whose army this really is. She shook his hand, and in that handshake in the empty range shed with the smell of gun oil in the air and the light going gold outside, the tide of the whole thing quietly, invisibly began to turn. But Brock Hessler was not finished. Brock Hessler was in fact just getting started, because a man like Hessler does not lose gracefully. When his sabotage of her equipment failed, and his attempt to catch her in a disciplinary violation failed, and his psychological warfare failed to make her quit, he did what men like him always do. He escalated. He decided that if he could not break her performance, he would break her record. He would attack the paperwork itself. He would begin quietly to build a false case, a folder full of half-truths and manufactured concerns that would justify removing her from the course on grounds that had nothing to do with whether she could shoot. He started documenting things that never happened. He started writing counseling statements for infractions she never committed and backdating them. He started collecting the move positions and bad time slots and extra duties, not as evidence of what he had done to her, but as evidence twisted around of a candidate who was struggling and showing signs of stress and possibly not suited to the demands of the course. He was very good at this. He had done it before to others, and it had always worked because paperwork is quiet and slow, and by the time anybody notices, it is usually too late. What he did not know was that Marcus Webb was building the exact opposite folder at the exact same time. And what he did not know was that every serial number, every position change, every schedule manipulation was also being written down in a small green notebook in a dead man's careful block printing by a woman who kept every promise she ever made. The collision was coming. Neither side knew exactly when, but it was coming the way weather comes over a mountain, and everybody who was paying attention could feel the pressure changing. 3 days before the big field exercise, Caldwell passed his preliminary stalk. It was a small thing in the scheme of the course. One young private lying still in the brush for 4 hours without moving, without panicking, without his chest closing up. But Elise, standing at the edge of the training area, watched him do it, and she felt something swell up in her that had nothing to do with rifles or records or colonels. Afterward, Caldwell came up to her, filthy and exhausted and grinning like a boy on Christmas morning. "I did it," he said. "I lay there 4 hours and I didn't panic. I told myself the story like you said. Stillness is the shield. Movement is the danger." And it worked. I actually fell asleep at one point. That's how calm I was. They had to walk right up on me to find me. He shook his head in wonder. 4 hours in the dark, and I was safe the whole time. "You were always going to be able to do it," Elise said. "You just had to tell your body a true story instead of a scared one." "I'm going to make it through this course," Caldwell said. "I actually think I'm going to make it, and it's because of you." He hesitated. "Sergeant Thorne, everybody knows what the colonel's doing to you. Everybody sees it, and nobody says anything because they're scared of him." He looked down at his boots. "I've been scared of him too, but you weren't scared to help me when it could have gotten you thrown out. So if it ever comes down to it, if anybody ever asks, I'll tell the truth about what he's doing. I don't care what it costs me. You saved me. I'll do the same for you." And one by one, over those last days before the field exercise, other candidates began to say the same thing to her. Quietly, in the chow line, in the barracks after lights out, in the back of the truck on the way to the range. Men who had watched her get the worst of everything and never complain, who had watched her outshoot all of them from the sun and the wind and the glare, who had watched her stay late to help a drowning private when she had every reason to look out only for herself. The Army runs on trust. Her father had told her that. Trust is a thing you build one kept word at a time. She had been building it quietly this whole time without even trying. And Brock Hessler, for all his rank and all his ribbons and all his 22 years, had been tearing his own down one act of cruelty at a time, and he did not even see it happening. The night before they left for the field, Elise sat alone on her bunk and took out the small green notebook. Not the one with the serial numbers, the other one, the one with the worn cover and the pages soft from handling. Her father's notebook. She turned to the last page he had ever written in that hospital, in the last week of his life, when his hands shook so badly the letters wandered across the page like they were lost. It said, "You are the guidance system. The rifle is just a tube. The bullet is just a rock. Everything that matters happens between your ears and in your heart. When the shot seems impossible, that's just the world telling you nobody's been patient enough to read it yet. Be patient. Read what others can't. And remember that I am always going to be right there behind you, spotting your win, calling your shot, proud of you, in a way I never once managed to be proud of myself. Become the sniper I never could be, and then become something more than that. Become you." She read it 3 times the way she always did, and then she closed the notebook and she put it under her pillow and she lay down in the dark, and somewhere across the base, Colonel Brock Hessler was adding another false page to another false folder, and neither of them slept much that night because both of them could feel it coming. 72 hours in Sector 9, the most punishing terrain in the entire course, the place where soldiers broke. And beyond Sector 9, waiting at the end of everything, hanging over the whole course like a shadow, was Target 17. The shot nobody had made in 40 years. The shot Brock Hessler had promised her she would never even get the chance to attempt. She closed her eyes. She could hear her father's voice, low and steady, the way it had sounded on 1,000 cold mornings on the mountain, when the frost was on the grass and the whole world was holding its breath. "Read what others can't," he said. "Be patient." "I will, Daddy," she thought. "I promise." And in the dark barracks at Fort Benning, Georgia Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne, daughter of the ghost of the high country keeper of every promise she had ever made, slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a person who knows exactly who she is and exactly what she is about to do. The storm was coming, and for once in his long and decorated career, Brock Hessler had picked the one candidate in 40 years who would not, could not, and absolutely would never break. The trucks rolled out before dawn, and Brock Hessler was standing at the drop point with a clipboard and a look on his face that Elise had learned to read like weather. 72 hours, he announced to the 20 candidates as they formed up in the gray half-light. Sector 9 has broken better soldiers than any of you. You will stalk, you will observe, you will shoot, and I will be watching every single one of you every single hour for any reason at all to send you home. His eyes found Elise, and they held there longer than they needed to. Some of you I'll be watching more closely than others. Nobody said anything, but Elise felt the men around her shift, felt the small, silent current of them, and she understood that something had changed in the days leading up to this. They weren't just enduring Hessler anymore. They were watching him too, watching what he did to her, keeping their own quiet count. "Sergeant Thorne," Hessler said, "since you're so confident, you'll take the northern approach. Alone, longest route, worst terrain, no partner." He smiled. "Unless that's too much for you." "It's not too much, sir," she said. "We'll see." And here was the first thing Hessler did not understand, standing there in the cold with his clipboard, believing he had just handed her a death sentence. The northern approach was the hardest road in Sector 9. Steepest slopes, thickest brush, least cover, most exposure to the observation posts that would be hunting for any candidate who moved wrong. He thought he was breaking her, but Elise Thorne had grown up on the northern face of a Montana mountain, where the wind came down off the peaks like a living thing, and a careless step meant a broken leg and a slow death with no one to hear you call. The northern approach was not a punishment to her. The northern approach was home. She said nothing about that. She just shouldered her gear and stepped off into the brush, and within 90 seconds she had vanished so completely that even Marcus Webb, who was watching her go, lost track of exactly where she was. Webb lowered his binoculars slowly. "Huh," he said to no one. The first 8 hours went the way Hessler expected them to go for everybody except her. Candidates got tangled in the brush. Candidates got spotted by the observation posts and got failing marks called down on them over the radio. Candidates lay in the heat, in the dust, and felt their bodies begin to come apart at the seams the way bodies do in Sector 9, where the sun does not quit and the ground offers no mercy, and the water in your canteen runs out faster than you ever believe it will. Caldwell was one of them. Caldwell got 2 hours into his stalk and felt the old panic rise up in his chest, felt the walls closing in, felt 19 years old and lost in the dark woods with a bear somewhere close. And then he heard Elise's voice in his head. Stillness is the shield. Movement is the danger. When you're still, they can't find you. He stopped. He breathed. He told his body the true story instead of the scared one. And he did not panic. He lay in the brush for 6 hours and moved 300 meters and reached his objective undetected. And when the observation post radioed in that they had lost track of candidate Caldwell entirely, Marcus Webb made a small note on his clipboard and almost smiled. But Elise was doing something else entirely. Around hour 12, the senior observer in the North Tower keyed his radio and said in a voice that had gone strange and uncertain, "Tower 2 to control. I have a problem." "Go ahead, Tower 2. I've got a candidate assigned to the northern approach, Thorne, and I can't find her." "Say again." "I can't find her, Control. I've been glassing this whole sector for 6 hours. Every other candidate I can track. I see them move, I mark them, I call them. But Thorne, I've got nothing. Not a movement, not a shadow, not a bent blade of grass. It's like the sector just swallowed her." There was a pause on the radio, and then Brock Hessler's voice came on the net, cold and sharp. "That's because she's not moving, Tower 2. She's frozen up. She's lost her nerve and she's hiding in a hole somewhere, waiting for the clock to run out. Mark her as non-progressing. She's failing the stalk." "Sir," the observer said slowly, "she's not failing the stalk. She hit her first checkpoint 4 hours ahead of schedule. I got her check-in on the marker. She's ahead of everybody. I just can't see her doing it." The radio went quiet. And in the North Tower, the observer lowered his binoculars and rubbed his eyes and picked them up again and looked out at a landscape that he had been staring at his whole adult life and thought, "I have never in 20 years failed to track a candidate. And I cannot find this woman. It is as though she is not moving across the ground. It is as though she has become the ground." That was hour 12. By hour 23, candidates had already been pulled from the exercise, one with heat exhaustion so bad he couldn't stand, one who'd panicked him and stood up in the open and gotten himself failed and then simply sat down and refused to go on, one who'd twisted his ankle in the rocks and couldn't continue. Sector 9 was doing exactly what Sector 9 always did. It was finding the cracks in people and breaking them open. And through it all, the North Tower could not find Elise Thorne. She was not doing anything supernatural. That was what nobody understood, what nobody could understand until much later. She was simply doing what her father had taught her, which was to stop being a person moving through terrain and to start being a part of the terrain that happened to be moving. She matched her pace to the wind so that when she moved, the grass around her moved too, and her motion disappeared inside the motion of the world. She read the light and stayed in the places the human eye slides past. She moved during the observer's blink in the moment the sun flared off a distant rock and made them look away. In the second the radio crackled and pulled their attention. Her father had a phrase for it. "Don't hide from the eye," he used to say. "Become boring to it. The eye wants motion, wants contrast, wants the thing that doesn't belong. So belong. Be so much a part of everything that there's nothing for the eye to catch on." She belonged to Sector 9. She had belonged to terrain like this since before she could remember. And so the sector that broke other soldiers held her like a mother holds a child and hid her and carried her forward checkpoint after checkpoint, hours ahead of every other candidate on the course. At hour 26, Brock Hessler climbed the North Tower himself. He did not believe the observer. He could not believe the observer. He took the man's binoculars out of his hands and put them to his own eyes and swept the sector slowly, methodically, a man who had spent 22 years learning to find soldiers who did not want to be found. And he could not find her either. "Where is she?" he said. It was not a question. It was a demand aimed at the landscape itself. "Sir, she checked in at marker 6:11 minutes ago," the observer said. "She's between 6 and 7 right now, somewhere in that draw. But I'm telling you, sir, I've been on that draw the whole time and I have not seen her once." Hessler stared through the binoculars until his eyes ached, and slowly in his chest, something cold began to turn over. Because Brock Hessler had told 20 candidates and one senior instructor and himself that Elise Thorne was a fraud, a poster, a political favor in boots. He had staked his authority on it. He had built a whole folder of lies on the foundation of it. And now he was watching that foundation crack, and he could feel it, and he did not have the humility to let it teach him anything. Instead, watching a woman he could not find move through terrain that broke everyone else, Brock Hessler felt his hatred of her curdle into something worse. Because there is nothing on earth a proud man hates more than the living proof that he was wrong. She's cheating somehow, he said. She has to be. Sir, nobody moves through that sector like that. Nobody. She's using the check-in markers to make it look like she's progressing, but she's cutting the route. She's not doing the actual stalk. She's found a shortcut, and she's gaming the system. He lowered the binoculars. His jaw was tight. Pull the marker logs. I want to prove she's skipping terrain, and get me the exact GPS on every check-in. She made a mistake somewhere. They always make a mistake. The observer looked at him, and here was a small moment that mattered more than either of them knew, because the observer was an honest man, and he had just watched something he could not explain, and he did not like being told to go find a crime that he was fairly sure did not exist. Sir, he said carefully, her check-ins are all in sequence, all in the right order, all within the time windows. If she were cutting the route, the marker sequence would be off. It's not off. It's perfect. Sir, I don't think she's cheating. I think she might just be that good. Brock Hessler turned and looked at the observer with an expression that made the man's stomach drop. Nobody asked you what you think, Hessler said quietly. Pull the logs. And he climbed down out of the tower, and the observer stood there, and for the first time began to understand that he was watching something that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with a colonel's pride, and he did not know what to do about it. So he did what most people do. He wrote down the exact time and the exact words quietly in the corner of his own log, just in case. He was not the only one keeping records anymore. That was the thing about Brock Hessler's war on Elise Thorne. Every time he pushed, he created another witness. At hour 30, they reached the live fire portion of the field exercise, and this was where Hessler believed he finally had her. The live fire stalk was the hardest single event in Sector 9. A candidate had to stalk into position undetected, range a target at unknown distance, calculate a firing solution accounting for wind and elevation and temperature and the curve of the earth itself, and put a round into a target the size of a dinner plate at distances that stretched past 800 meters. And they had to do it while observers with high-powered optics hunted them the entire time. And the moment a candidate was spotted, the event was failed. Hessler had arranged the conditions carefully. He had put Elise on the worst firing lane into the wind with the sun in her optic at the hottest hour of the day, when the mirage would boil up off the ground and turn the air into a shimmering wall that made ranging a target nearly impossible. He watched from the tower as she stalked in. He watched the observers hunt for her. He watched them fail to find her again, and he felt the cold thing turn over in his chest again, and he told himself, it doesn't matter if they can't see her. The shot is impossible in these conditions. She'll take it, and she'll miss, and I'll have it on the record. A clean failure. Finally, Elise settled into her firing position at hour 31, and she read the conditions the way her father had taught her to read them, which was not with instruments, but with her whole body. She felt the wind on the back of her neck and watched it move the grass in the valley below, watched how it moved differently at 100 meters than at 400, watched the invisible layers of it stack and shift. She watched the mirage boil, and she did not curse it the way the other candidates cursed it, because her father had taught her that mirage is not your enemy. Mirage is the wind made visible. Read the boil, and the boil tells you the wind. The thing that blinds everyone else is the thing that tells you the truth if you're patient enough to read it. She was patient. She had always been patient. Patience was the first thing the mountain had taught her, and the last thing her father had asked of her. She lay in that firing position for 40 minutes without moving, reading the valley, letting the wind teach her its patterns, waiting for the moment when the boil and the grass and the light all told her the same story at the same time. And in the tower, Brock Hessler grew impatient. What is she doing? He said. She's been in position half an hour. Why hasn't she fired? She's reading the conditions, sir, Webb said. Webb had come up to the tower. Webb was watching too. In these conditions, sir, a smart shooter waits for a lull, a window. It might take an hour. She's stalling. She knows she can't make the shot, so she's running out the clock. Hessler keyed the radio. Control what? A time limit on Thorne's firing solution, 2 minutes. If she doesn't fire in 2 minutes, she fails the event for indecision. Webb turned and looked at him. Sir, there's no time limit on the live fire stalk. There's never been a time limit. The whole point is that she takes the shot when the conditions are right. If you put a 2-minute clock on her, you're changing the standard just for her. I'm the range officer, Sergeant Webb. I set the standard. Sir, Webb's voice was very level, very careful, the voice of a man walking on ice and knowing it. With respect, if you put a rule on her that you haven't put on any other candidate and it's in the log that way, and this ever gets reviewed, that's going to look like exactly what it is. The tower went quiet. And Brock Hessler, who was not a stupid man, understood in that moment that Marcus Webb was warning him. Not threatening, warning, telling him as carefully as a sergeant can tell a colonel that there was a record and that the record was being watched and that he was about to write something into it that he would not be able to explain later. It was the first time in the entire course that anyone had made Brock Hessler hesitate. His hand was on the radio. 2 minutes. All he had to do was say it. And he looked at Webb and he looked at the log. And for one long moment, the whole thing hung in the balance. And then down in the valley, Elise Thorne fired. The crack of the rifle rolled up out of the draw and across the range, and every head in the tower snapped around, and the observers scrambled to find her point of impact, and there was a long, terrible, silent second where nobody knew. And then the radio crackled. Control to tower. Target impact confirmed. Center mass. First round hit at 840 meters into the wind through the mirage. A pause. Sir, that's the best live fire score of the exercise. By a wide margin. It's not even close. Brock Hessler took his hand off the radio. He did not say anything. And Marcus Webb, standing beside him, said quietly so only Hessler could hear, "She read the wind through the mirage, sir. She waited for the window and she took it in the 1 second it opened. I've been doing this 22 years and I've seen maybe 3 shooters who could have made that shot in those conditions." He let that sit for a moment. You put her on the worst lane in the worst hour to make her fail. And she made the best shot of the whole course out of it. Sir, at some point, a man has to ask himself whether he's testing a soldier or fighting one. Hessler turned and looked at him. And for just a moment, just a flicker, Webb saw something move behind the colonel's eyes that might have been doubt. And then it was gone, and the wall came back up, and Hessler said, "Get out of my tower, Sergeant." Webb got out of the tower. But he had seen it, the flicker, the doubt, and he knew the way you know a fever has broken that something had shifted. Because a man who is certain does not feel doubt. And Brock Hessler, for the first time, was no longer certain. That was hour 31. The problem with certainty, once it cracks, is that it does not crack cleanly. It does not lead a proud man toward humility. It leads him toward panic. And a panicking man makes mistakes. Brock Hessler made his mistake at hour 40. He had been up in this tower and down in the tower and out in the sector for the better part of 2 days, sleeping in snatches driven by something that had stopped being about training a long time ago and had become entirely about a woman he could not break. And somewhere in the exhaustion and the panic, he decided that if he could not fail her on performance and could not fail her on discipline, he would remove her from the exercise on a safety violation. Because a safety violation was subjective. A safety violation was a range officer's judgment call. A safety violation could not be argued with. So he went out to her firing position himself at hour 40 in the heat of the day, and he found her lying in her hide exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. "Sergeant Thorne," he said, "on your feet." She rose, slow, controlled, filthy from 2 days in the sector, but steady, her eyes clear. "Your muzzle was pointed in an unsafe direction," Hessler said. "I observed it just now. That's a safety violation. That's an automatic removal from the exercise." Elise looked at him. And here was the thing. Her muzzle had not been pointed in an unsafe direction. Both of them knew it. It was a lie, a naked, obvious lie invented on the spot by a desperate man who had run out of real weapons and had finally reached for a fake one. "My muzzle was pointed downrange, sir," she said quietly. "At the target, where it's supposed to be." "Are you calling me a liar, Sergeant?" "No, sir," she said. "I'm telling you what my muzzle was doing. What you call it is up to you. I'm the range safety officer. My observation is final. You're done. Get your gear and get off my range." And this was the moment Brock Hessler had been building toward for 2 days, the moment he thought would finally end it. And it might have worked. It really might have worked, except for one thing that Hessler did not know. Marcus Webb had followed him out. Webb had seen the colonel leave the tower and head for Thorne's position, with a look on his face that Webb had learned to read over 22 years, the look of a man about to do something he'd need to lie about later. And Webb had followed quietly at a distance, and he had arrived at the edge of the hide just in time to see the whole thing. The muzzle pointed downrange exactly where it should be. The Colonel's lie. All of it. And Webb was not alone, because the live fire event had 2 safety observers assigned to every position, and both of them were right there in the hide 20 feet away, and both of them had also seen exactly where that muzzle was pointed. Colonel Hessler, Webb said, stepping forward. Sir, I need to say something for the record. Hessler turned, and the look on his face when he saw Webb, and then saw the 2 safety observers behind Webb, was the look of a man who has just realized he is standing in the open with no cover. Sir, Webb said, and his voice carried deliberately so that both observers could hear every word. I was observing Sergeant Thorne's position. Her muzzle was pointed downrange at the target, so we're both safety observers. That's 3 witnesses, sir. If you call a safety violation on this position, all 3 of us are going to have to document that we observed the muzzle in a safe direction. That'll go in the record, sir, right next to your call, and they won't match. The silence in that hide was the loudest silence Elise had ever heard, because Webb had just done something extraordinary. He had not accused the Colonel of anything. He had not raised his voice. He had simply calmly laid out the facts and let Hessler see them. 3 witnesses, a written record, a lie that would not survive contact with the truth. He had given Hessler a way out too. That was the thing. He had not cornered him. He had said in effect, walk away from this one, sir, and it never happened. Push it, and it becomes a thing that can't be taken back. And Brock Hessler stood there in the heat at hour 40, exhausted and cornered and staring at the wreckage of his own certainty, and he made a choice. Carry on, Sergeant Thorne, he said, and he turned and walked away. It was the first time he had ever backed down from anything, and everyone in that hide knew it, and nobody said a word, and Elise watched him walk back toward the tower with his shoulders rigid and his fists clenched, and she felt no triumph at all. What she felt was something closer to sorrow, because she understood something in that moment that most people never understand about the men who try to break them. She understood that Brock Hessler was not strong, he was frightened. He had been frightened this whole time, and a frightened man with power is the most dangerous thing in the world, and also the most pitiable, and she felt both of those things at once watching him go. Webb came and stood beside her. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me, Webb said. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I've watched that man do this to people for 3 years, and I never had 3 witnesses and a muzzle pointed the right way before. You gave me the chance to do the right thing. That's on you, not me. He looked at her. How you holding up, Sergeant? 40 hours in. 32 to go. You've been through hell out here, and there's more coming. I've been through worse, she said. And Elise was quiet for a moment. And then she said, the night my father died, I sat in that hospital for 11 hours holding his hand while the machines counted him down. And there was nothing I could do. Not one thing. All that skill he gave me all those years on the mountain, and I couldn't do a single thing to keep him here. She looked out over the valley. That was worse than Sector 9, Sergeant. Sector 9 is just heat and rocks and a colonel who doesn't like me. I can do something about all 3 of those. That night in the hospital, I couldn't do anything about the only thing that mattered. She picked up her rifle. So no, this isn't the worst thing. This is just the hardest thing, and those aren't the same. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Your father, he said, the ghost of the high country, he'd be proud of you. You know that, right? And something crossed Elise's face, then some flicker of the grief she carried so carefully, so quietly all the time. He never once said he was proud of me, she said softly. 40 years he spent so angry that he never got to prove what he was, that I don't think he had it in him to be proud of anybody, even me. He loved me. I know he loved me. But he couldn't say the other thing because he'd never gotten to hear it himself, and you can't give away something nobody ever gave you. She looked at Webb. That's why I'm here, Sergeant. Not for a qualification, not to beat the colonel. I'm here because my father spent his whole life believing he wasn't good enough, and it killed him slowly from the inside. And I refuse to die that way. I refuse to let a man like Hessler put that same poison in me. Every shot I make out here is me telling my father, wherever he is, that his life meant something, that everything he taught me was real, that he was good enough all along and the world was just too blind to see it. Her voice caught just slightly. That's what target 17 is. That's what it's really about. It's not a shot. It's 40 years of a good man being told he didn't matter. And I'm going to prove that he did. Marcus Webb, who had been a hard man for a long time, had to look away for a moment. Then you'd better finish this exercise, he said when he could speak again. Because you don't get to target 17 without finishing Sector 9. 32 hours, Sergeant. Go show them what your daddy taught you. The last 32 hours of Sector 9 were the hardest of Elise Thorne's life, and she moved through them like a woman possessed by something larger than herself. The heat broke bodies. 2 more candidates went down. The terrain broke ankles and broke wills and broke the careful plans of men who had thought they were ready. And through all of it, Elise moved with a patience and a precision that stopped looking like skill and started looking like something closer to prayer. At hour 50, she completed the night observation exercise, identifying and correctly ranging every target in her sector, while candidates all around her lost count and lost focus and lost their way in the dark. At hour 58, she completed the final stalk, moving 400 meters across open ground, under the noses of 6 observers, and not one of them saw her do it. And when she rose up out of the grass, at the objective close enough to touch the observer who'd been hunting her, the man actually cried out in surprise and fell backward because he had been staring at that exact patch of ground for 2 hours and had seen nothing at all. At hour 65, exhausted beyond anything she had ever known, running on nothing but her father's voice in her head and the promise she had made him, she completed the final live fire event, and her scores were not just the best of her class. They were the best anyone at Fort Benning had recorded in Sector 9 in 40 years. 40 years. The same 40 years that Target 17 had stood unbeaten. The same 40 years her father had spent wanting and never getting. There was something almost unbearable in that number, in the way it kept appearing, like the universe itself was drawing a line between what her father had endured and what she was about to attempt. When she walked out of Sector 9 at hour 72, filthy and hollow-eyed and swaying on her feet, the other candidates who had survived the exercise were already at the assembly point. And as she came out of the tree line, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the course. They stood up. All of them. Every candidate who had made it through. They stood up as she walked past, and they did not cheer because they were too tired to cheer, and because cheering wasn't the point. They just stood. In silence. The way men stand when something passes that deserves respect. And Caldwell was among them, and his eyes were wet, and as she passed him, he said quietly, "Best score in 40 years, Sergeant. You did it." "We did it," she said. "You made it through private, 4 hours in the dark, and you didn't panic once. Because of you." "No," she said, "because of you. I had reminded you who you already were." And she kept walking past the standing men toward the tower where Brock Hessler stood watching her come with an expression that no one could read. Because Brock Hessler had a problem now, and he knew it. He had told everyone she would fail. He had staked his authority, his reputation, his certainty on the promise that Elise Thorne would break in Sector 9. And she had not broken. She had set a record that would stand for another 40 years. And every candidate on that field had watched it happen, and every one of them knew what he had tried to do to her. And every one of them had just stood up in silent tribute to the woman he'd sworn was a fraud. His folder of lies was still in his office. All those false counseling statements, all those manufactured concerns, all that careful paperwork built to justify removing her. It was worthless now. You cannot claim a candidate is unfit and struggling when she has just posted the best score in the history of the course. The lies would not survive the truth. Webb had a record. The observers had records. Even the honest man in the North Tower had a record. And there was one thing left. One final event. The thing the whole course had been building toward from the very first morning when Hessler tore that qualification sheet in half. Target 17. He had promised her she would never even get the chance to attempt it. He had been so certain she would wash out long before qualification day that he had said it to her face in front of the whole formation on the first morning. "It is impossible. It will not be beaten by you." And now she was going to get her chance. There was no way to stop it. She had earned it in the open in front of witnesses so completely that no folder of lies could take it away. Qualification day was coming, and Target 17 was waiting, and Brock Hessler was going to have to stand there and watch her attempt the shot he had sworn no one could make. He watched her walk toward the tower. This woman he had tried so hard to break, filthy and exhausted and utterly unbroken. And for the first time in his long career, Colonel Brock Hessler felt something he did not have a name for. It was not quite fear. It was not quite shame. It was the feeling a man gets when the ground he has stood on his whole life shifts under his feet, and he understands in a cold rush that everything he was certain of might have been wrong. Elise reached the base of the tower. She looked up at him, and for a long moment, the colonel and the candidate simply looked at each other across everything that had happened, across the sabotaged rifle, and the false folder, and the lie in the hide, and the record that could not be denied. "Best score in 40 years, sir," she said quietly. "Reporting off Sector 9. Hessler said nothing. "You told me on the first morning that I'd quit," she said. "You told me to remember that you said so." She held his gaze steady as stone. "I remembered, sir, every word, just like I promised." And then she turned and walked away toward the barracks, to sleep, to recover, to prepare for the one shot that everything had been building toward, and she left Colonel Brock Hessler standing alone in his tower, staring after her with the whole architecture of his certainty crumbling around him, and no idea in the world what he was going to do when qualification day came, and she stepped up to attempt the impossible. She slept for 14 hours, and when she woke, the whole base had changed around her. She did not know it yet. She only knew that she felt the way you feel after a long fever breaks, hollowed out and clean and strangely light. But while she slept, the story of what she had done in Sector 9 had moved through Fort Benning the way fire moves through dry grass, from the candidates to the cadre to the clerks to the officers, until by the time she opened her eyes, there was not a single person on that base who had not heard the number. Best score in 40 years. And attached to that number, always spoken quietly, was the other thing. And the colonel tried to break her the whole way through. Marcus Webb was waiting for her outside the barracks when she came out. "You need to know something before you walk into the mess hall," he said. "Things have changed while you were asleep." "Changed how? You'll see." She walked into the mess hall, and every conversation stopped. She had walked into that mess hall for weeks and been treated like a problem, like a rumor, like a thing that had been foisted on the course by people in Washington who didn't understand what real soldiers were. And now she walked in, and men who had never looked at her twice stood up from their tables. Not all of them, but enough that it could not be missed. And a master sergeant she had never spoken to in her life crossed the room and stopped in front of her and said, "Sergeant Thorne, I've been at this a long time. I want to shake the hand of somebody who did what you did out there." And he shook her hand, and then he went back to his breakfast, and the mess hall slowly filled again with the sound of talk, and everything was different. Elise sat down with her tray, and her hands were not quite steady, and Webb sat down across from her. "You did that," he said. "Not me, not anybody else. You lay in that sector for 72 hours, and you refused to break, and now they know. They all know. The thing Hessler spent weeks trying to make everybody believe, that you didn't belong here, you just buried it. You buried it so deep it's never coming back." "Then why don't I feel like I won anything?" she asked quietly. Webb looked at her. "Because you haven't yet," he said. "Because there's still one thing left. And you and I both know it, and so does every man in this room, and so does the colonel." He lowered his voice. "Target 17, qualification day, day after tomorrow." Elise put down her fork. "Tell me about it," she said. "The real story, not the legend. I've heard the legend. I want to know what's actually out there." And Webb told her. He told her that Target 17 sat at the far end of the qualification range, across a wide valley at a distance that the course officially listed, but that most shooters privately believed was actually longer because the range had been laid out 40 years ago by men who measured with the tools they had, and nobody had ever remeasured it because nobody had ever needed to, because nobody had ever hit it. He told her that the valley in between was a wind trap, a place where the air came down off two ridgelines and collided and swirled and stacked into layers that moved in different directions at different heights, so that a bullet fired across it passed through 3 or 4 separate wind conditions on its way to the target, each one pushing it a different way. He told her that the thermal conditions shifted the mirage so badly that on most days you couldn't even see the target clearly, just a shimmer where it was supposed to be. And he told her that in 40 years, hundreds of the best shooters the Army had produced had stepped up to that firing line and sent their rounds out across that valley, and every single one of them had missed. "Not close," Webb said. "Not almost. Missed. The valley eats the bullet. Nobody's ever even been able to figure out where their rounds are landing because the wind takes them so far off that they go into the hills and disappear. 40 years, Sergeant. It's not a target anymore. It's a monument to the idea that some things can't be done. Elise was quiet for a long moment. My father would have loved it, she said finally. What? A shot everybody says is impossible. A wind nobody can read. A target nobody's touched in 40 years. A small, sad smile touched the corner of her mouth. That's the shot he dreamed about his whole life. That's the exact thing he spent 40 years wishing somebody would put in front of him. And they never did, because he never wore the uniform, so he never got the chance. She looked at Webb, and now here it is, the exact shot my father dreamed of. And I'm the one who gets to take it. In his place, with everything he taught me. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. You understand what that means to me, Sergeant. This isn't a test. This is the thing my father wanted more than anything in the world, and I get to do it for him. If I make that shot, he made it. Everything he was, everything he knew, it goes downrange with that bullet, and it hits that target, and it finally proves that he was everything he ever believed he could be, and the world just never let him show it. Webb didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said quietly, and if you miss, and Elise looked at him, and the brightness in her eyes did not dim. Then I missed, she said, and I'll have missed the same shot that hundreds of the best shooters in the Army missed. And I'll walk away knowing I stood where my father dreamed of standing, and I took the shot he never got to take. That's not failure, Sergeant. That's just honoring him. The failure would be not taking it. The failure would be being too afraid of missing to even treat it. She picked up her fork again. My father used to say the only shot you're guaranteed to miss is the one you don't take. I'm taking it. Whatever happens, I'm taking it. That was the morning after Sector 9. The next day, the day before qualification, Brock Hessler made his last move. He had spent 2 days watching the base turn against him, watching men stand up in the mess hall for a woman he'd tried to destroy, watching the folder of lies in his office desk grow more worthless by the hour. And something in him had gone past panic and into a kind of cold, final desperation. He knew that if she stepped up to target 17 on qualification day, one of two things would happen, and both of them destroyed him. Either she would miss like everyone missed, and he would have to stand there and watch the base's sympathy for her curdle into something even more dangerous to him, a martyr, a woman who did everything right and got beaten by an impossible test and a hostile colonel. Or she would hit it, and if she hit it, everything he had said about her for weeks, every lie, every doubt, every cruelty would be exposed in a single instant in front of the entire command. He could not allow her to take the shot, so he went on the day before qualification to the office of Colonel Patricia Drummond, the senior officer overseeing the qualification course, and he made his case to have Elise Thorne removed before qualification day on medical grounds. She's exhausted, he told Drummond. 72 hours in Sector 9. She's not medically fit to safely handle a weapon on the qualification range. As range safety officer, it's my judgment that she should be held back from qualification for her own safety and the safety of others. She can attempt it in the next cycle when she's recovered. It was a clever move. It sounded like concern. It sounded reasonable. And the next cycle was 4 months away, and Elise's waiver, the special authorization that had allowed her to attempt the course at all, expired in 6 weeks. Holding her back to the next cycle was not holding her back. It was ending her. And Hessler knew it, and he said it with a straight face dressed up as safety, and he almost got away with it. Colonel Patricia Drummond was not a fool. She had been hearing about Elise Thorne for 2 days. She had heard the number from Sector 9, and she had heard in the careful, indirect way that senior officers hear things the other story too, the one about a colonel and a candidate in a course that had stopped being fair a long time ago. So when Brock Hessler sat in her office and made his reasonable, concerned, clever case for removing Elise Thorne on medical grounds, Colonel Drummond listened to every word. And then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Colonel Hessler, has Sergeant Thorne been seen by a medical officer? No, ma'am, but based on my observation. Then how do you know she's not medically fit? Ma'am, 72 hours in Sector 9, anyone would be. Every candidate who completed Sector 9 did 72 hours, Colonel. Are you recommending we hold all of them back from qualification? Hessler stopped. No, ma'am. Just Sergeant Thorne. She had the hardest route, the northern approach, and she She had the hardest route because you assigned it to her, Colonel. That's in the log. Drummond folded her hands on her desk. I've read the log. I've read all of it. The route assignments, the firing lane assignments, the time slot assignments, the equipment issue on day one. She let that sit for a moment. I've also received an unusual number of voluntary statements over the last 2 days, Colonel. From candidates, from cadre, from your own instructors, all saying more or less the same thing. And now you're sitting in my office trying to remove the highest scoring candidate in the 40-year history of this course on medical grounds without a single medical evaluation the day before she's scheduled to attempt the one event you've told everyone she can't complete. Her voice was very level. Would you like to know how that looks from where I'm sitting, Colonel? The office was very quiet. Brock Hessler understood in that moment that he had walked into a trap that he had built for himself, one careful lie at a time, over the course of weeks. Every route he'd stacked against her, every lane, every time slot, every cruelty was written down somewhere. And it had all been pointing at this room, at this conversation, at this moment, when a senior officer laid it all out on the desk in front of him and asked him to explain it. He could not explain it. Sergeant Thorne will attempt qualification tomorrow on schedule with every other candidate, Colonel Drummond said. And I will personally be present to observe all of it. Do you understand me, Colonel Hessler? Yes, ma'am, Hessler said. One more thing. Drummond leaned forward. If I find out that anything happens to that candidate's equipment tonight, or that her firing conditions tomorrow are anything other than identical to every other candidate's, I will not be conducting a training review, Colonel. I will be conducting an investigation. And I think we both know what a real investigation would find given everything that's already in that log. She sat back. Dismissed. Brock Hessler walked out of Colonel Drummond's office, a smaller man than he had walked in. And that was the twist that changed everything, though. Almost no one knew it had happened. Because the thing Hessler had counted on all along from the very first morning was that he held all the cards and Elise held none. He had said it to her face in his office weeks ago. I hold every card and you hold none. And it had been true then. But it was not true anymore. Because every card he'd played against her, every route and lane and lie, had been quietly collected by Webb, by the observers, by the honest man in the North Tower, by candidates who'd found the courage to write statements and stacked into a hand held by a senior officer who did not like what she saw. The cards had changed hands one at a time without Hessler ever noticing, and now Colonel Patricia Drummond held all of them, and Brock Hessler held nothing at all. He did not sabotage her equipment that night. He wanted to. Every instinct in him screamed to do it, to find some way anywhere to make sure that rifle did not put a round on target 17 the next morning. But Drummond's warning sat in his chest like a stone, and for the first time the fear of being caught outweighed the need to win. So he did nothing. And that nothing, that single act of not doing, was the closest thing to fairness he had shown Elise Thorne since the day she arrived. Elise slept well that night. She did not know about Drummond. She did not know about Hessler's last move or how close she had come to being removed. She only knew that qualification day was coming and that the shot her father had dreamed of his whole life was waiting for her across a valley of impossible wind. She took out his notebook one last time, the worn one, and she read the last page again in the dark. You are the guidance system. The rifle is just a tube. The bullet is just a rock. Everything that matters happens between your ears and in your heart. I know, Daddy, she whispered. I know. And she read the last lines, the ones she could recite from memory, now the ones she had read 1,000 times. Become the sniper I never could be, and then become something more than that, become you. She closed the notebook, and for the first time lying there in the dark the night before the impossible shot, she let herself cry. Not the choked back, held tight crying she'd allowed herself in flashes throughout the course. Real crying. The kind that comes up from somewhere deep and old. The kind she'd been holding back for 8 months since the hospital, since the machines went quiet. She cried for her father, who had spent 40 years believing he wasn't good enough, who had died without ever hearing the words he'd needed his whole life, who had poured everything he was into a daughter because he'd run out of hope for himself. She cried for the shot he never got to take. And she cried a little for herself, for the weight of carrying all of it, the legacy and the grief and the promise alone across all these miles and all these weeks to this final morning. And when she was done crying, she felt clean. Clean the way the mountain felt after a storm, and she slept. Qualification day. 0600. The candidates formed up on the qualification range, and the air was cool and still, the way it is early before the sun starts moving the wind around and across the valley. At the far end of everything sat Target 17. A small steel plate, impossibly far, a shimmer even now in the still morning air. A thing you had to trust was there more than you could actually see. Colonel Patricia Drummond stood at the firing line. She had said she would be present, and she was, and her presence changed the whole feel of the range, because everyone knew who she was, and everyone understood that when the senior officer overseeing the course shows up personally to watch a single event, it means that event has become about more than shooting. Brock Hessler stood at the firing line too because he had to, because he was the range officer, and he could not have looked more like a man standing on a gallows if he had tried. There were other events that morning, other targets, the standard qualification course of fire, and the candidates worked through them one by one. Elise shot them cleanly, coldly, perfectly, but everyone knew none of it mattered, because everyone knew what was waiting at the end. And one by one, the standard events were completed, and one by one, the range worked its way toward the last event, the one that had hung over the entire course from the first morning. And finally, at 10:40 in the morning, with the sun climbing and the first stirrings of the valley wind beginning to move the grass on the far ridgelines, Brock Hessler cleared his throat and said in a voice that did not sound like his own, "Final event, Target 17. Candidates will attempt in order, 1 round each. This is a demonstration of extreme long-range engagement." He paused. "The historical hit rate on this target is 0. Candidates should not be discouraged by a miss. No one is expected to make this shot." And they began. One by one, the candidates who had survived Sector 9 stepped up to the firing line, and one by one, they lay down behind their rifles, and one by one, they looked out across that valley at the impossible shimmer of Target 17, and one by one, they took their shot, and one by one, they missed. The first candidate's round vanished into the hills to the right, pushed by a wind he never saw. The second candidate's round went low and left and disappeared. The third candidate lay behind his rifle for 2 full minutes trying to read a wind that could not be read, and finally fired and missed by so much that the observers could not even call where the round had gone. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth, miss after miss after miss, the valley eating every bullet. 40 years of history repeating itself. One candidate at a time, and with every miss, the mood on the firing line grew heavier, because every miss was proof, fresh proof, that the thing was impossible, that it had always been impossible, that it would always be impossible. Caldwell stepped up. He looked back once at Elise before he lay down behind his rifle, and she gave him a small nod. And he settled in, and he looked out across the valley, and he did everything she had taught him, and he took his time, and he read what he could read, and he fired, and he missed. But he missed close, closer than anyone. The observers actually called his round for the first time all morning, low impact just below, and left of the plate close enough that a murmur went through the firing line. And Caldwell stood up, and he was not ashamed, because he had come closer than any candidate had come, and he walked back past Elise and said quietly, "The wind at the bottom of the valley, Sergeant. It's stronger than it looks. It comes off the left ridge about 2/3 of the way across. That's what took my round." And then he added so quietly only she could hear, "Go get it. Go get it for both of us. Go get it for your dad." And then there was only Elise. The whole range had gone silent. Colonel Drummond was watching. Brock Hessler was watching, rigid, his jaw clenched so hard it ached, a man watching the 2 possible ends of his career walk toward him and unable to stop either one. Marcus Webb was watching, and his hands, he noticed with surprise, were not quite steady. Every candidate who had already shot and missed was watching, and across the valley, small and silent and impossibly far, Target 17 waited, as it had waited for 40 years for someone patient enough to read what could not be read. "Sergeant Thorne," Brock Hessler said, and his voice caught just slightly on her name. "You may take your position." Elise stepped up to the firing line, and she did not lie down right away. That was the first thing everyone noticed. She stood there at the firing line, and she looked out across the valley, and she was not looking at the target. She was looking at everything else. She was looking at the grass on the near ridge and the grass on the far ridge and the way they moved differently. She was looking at the shimmer of the mirage and reading the wind inside it the way her father had taught her. Mirage is the wind made visible. She was looking at the birds, at how they rode the air, at where they climbed and where they dropped. She was reading the whole valley, all of it at once, the way you read a face you've known your whole life. And in her head, she heard her father's voice, low and steady, the way it had sounded on 10,000 cold mornings on the mountain. "Don't shoot the target," he said. "Shoot the wind. The target's not moving. The wind is. Solve the wind, and the target solves itself." She knelt, and then she lay down behind her rifle, and she built her position the way she had built it 10,000 times, bone on bone, no muscle, fighting the weight, her body going still and quiet, and part of the ground beneath her. And she began to wait. The seconds stretched out. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. The whole range holding its breath, watching her lie there motionless, reading a wind that no one else could read, waiting for something that no one else could see. And Brock Hessler felt every second of it, like a hand closing around his throat, because he understood, watching her, that she was not going to rush it, that she was not going to throw the shot away, that she was going to wait for exactly the right moment, no matter how long it took, and that this was the difference between her and everyone who had ever failed at this target. They had shot at the target. She was going to shoot at the exact right second, and not one instant before. 3 minutes. The wind moved. She felt it change, felt the whole valley shift as a gust came down off the left ridge, the one Caldwell had warned her about, and she did not fire because that was the wrong moment. That was the moment that had taken Caldwell's round low and left. She waded through it. She let it pass. She felt the valley settle, felt the layers of air begin to realign, felt the whole vast, complicated system of wind and thermal and light start to move toward a single instant of stillness. A window, the kind of window her father had taught her, comes to every valley if you are only patient enough to wait for it. Read what others can't, her father whispered. Be patient. 4 minutes. And then she felt it coming. The window, the moment when the wind on the near side and the wind in the middle and the wind on the far side all aligned just for a heartbeat into a single readable condition. A brief, impossible instant of clarity in a valley that had defeated 40 years of shooters, precisely because that instant was so rare and so short that no one had ever been patient enough or skilled enough to catch it. She caught it. Her finger began to take up the slack on the trigger, slow, smooth, the way her father had taught her. Don't pull the trigger. Surprise yourself with the break, and in the last half second before the shot, she felt something she had never felt before. A presence warm and steady and close right behind her, spotting her wind, calling her shot exactly the way he'd promised in the last words he ever wrote. "I am always, always going to be right there behind you. This one's for you, Daddy," she breathed. And Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne, daughter of the ghost of the high country keeper of every promise she had ever made, standing where her father had dreamed of standing, his whole life took up the last ounce of pressure on the trigger. The rifle fired. The crack of it rolled out across the valley, and then there was nothing. Just silence. Just the long, terrible wait while a single bullet had traveled nearly a mile across a valley that had swallowed every round fired at it for 40 years, and every soul on that firing line stopped breathing, and time itself seemed to stretch out thin and taut as a wire. 1 second, the bullet was still flying. 2 seconds, still flying out across the wind trap through the layers of colliding air, through the shimmer of the mirage toward the impossible shimmer of steel at the far end of everything. And then faint and clear and unmistakable across the whole silent valley came a sound that no one at Fort Benning had heard in 40 years. A metallic clang, the clang of a bullet striking steel. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody believed it. The sound hung in the air over the valley. Impossible, undeniable. And every person on that firing line stood frozen because the thing they had just heard could not be real. And yet they had all heard it, and it echoed off the ridgelines and came back to them a second time. Clang as if the valley itself were confirming it, as if 40 years of silence were breaking all at once. And then the observers at the spotting scopes began to shout. Impact, impact on target center plate. Confirmed impact on target 17. And the firing line exploded. The candidates who had missed every one of them came up off the ground and off their feet and started shouting, roaring a sound that was not quite words, the sound men make when they have witnessed something they will tell their grandchildren about. Caldwell was screaming her name. Men who had watched her get the worst of everything for weeks were pounding each other on the back and pointing across the valley and shouting that she'd done it, she'd done it, she'd actually done it. 40 years of impossible had just ended in front of their eyes, and they could not contain it, and the whole firing line dissolved into a chaos of disbelief and joy. And in the middle of it, Elise Thorne did not move. She lay behind her rifle exactly as she had been, and she did not celebrate, and she did not cheer, and she did not even smile. She lay there with her eyes still to the scope, looking at the small steel plate a mile away that was now swinging gently on its mount, still moving from the strike, and her hands were steady on the rifle, and her breathing was slow, and down her cheek, one at a time, ran tears that she did not wipe away. "I did it, Daddy," she whispered so quietly that no one heard her over the roar. "We did it. You did it. You finally did it." Because she understood in a way that no one else on that firing line could understand what had just happened. It was not that a candidate had hit a target. It was that a good man who had spent 40 years believing he wasn't good enough had just been proven right 40 years too late through the hands of the daughter he'd poured himself into. Every cold morning on the mountain, every trick in secret and hard-won piece of knowledge, every hour at the kitchen table by lamplight, all of it had just traveled a mile across an impossible valley and struck a piece of steel that had defeated everyone who ever tried, and it had proven finally undeniably that the ghost of the high country had been exactly what he always believed he was, and that the only thing he ever lacked was the chance. She had given him his chance. From beyond the grave, she had given her father the one thing the world had denied him his whole life, and that was worth more than any qualification, any record, any victory over any colonel. That was worth everything. Marcus Webb was the first one to reach her. He came and knelt down beside her, this hard man who had been in the army for 22 years, and his own eyes were wet, and he did not say anything at first because he did not trust his voice. And then he put his hand on her shoulder and he said, "Sergeant Thorne, in 22 years, I have never seen anything like that. Not close, not in the same universe." His voice broke. "You read that valley. You waited for a window that lasted maybe 2 seconds and you caught it. And you put a round on a target that's beaten every shooter this army ever produced." He shook his head. "That wasn't a shot. I don't know what that was, but it wasn't a shot." Elise finally lifted her eye from the scope, and she looked at Webb, and her face was wet with tears, and she said, "It was my father, Sergeant. That's what it was. That was my father finally getting to be who he always was." She sat up slowly. "He was right behind me, the whole time. I felt him. Right at the end, I felt him there calling my win, just like he promised he would." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He made that shot, Sergeant, not me. He made it. I was just the guidance system. That's what he always told me. You're the guidance system. The rifle's just a tube. The bullet's just a rock." Her voice cracked. "He was the shot, Sergeant. I was just the hands that finally got to take it for him." Marcus Webb, who had spent his whole life being hard, put his arms around her right there on the firing line and held her while she cried and did not say a word because there were no words, because some things are too big for words. 20 feet away, Colonel Patricia Drummond stood at the firing line, and she had not moved, and she had not spoken, and she was looking across the valley at the swinging steel plate with an expression of something close to reverence. And beside her stood Colonel Brock Hessler, and he had gone completely, utterly white, because Brock Hessler had just watched his entire world end. He had told 20 candidates that she would fail. He had told them on the first morning, tearing her qualification sheet in half in the mud. He had told a senior instructor she was a fraud, a poster, a political favor in boots. He had sabotaged her rifle, stacked her rotes, manipulated her firing conditions, lied to her face in a hide in Sector 9, and built a folder of manufactured lies designed to destroy her. He had staked his authority, his reputation, his 22 years, his entire understanding of himself as a man who could read soldiers on the single absolute certainty that Elise Thorne could not do what she had just done. And she had done it. She had done the thing that no one had done in 40 years. She had done it on the first attempt. She had done it in front of the entire command, in front of the senior officer overseeing the course, in front of every candidate he had told that she would fail. And every single one of them now knew beyond any possibility of doubt that Brock Hessler had been wrong. Not just wrong, catastrophically, publicly, undeniably wrong about the one thing he had been most certain of. There was nowhere to hide from it. There was no folder that could survive it. There was no lie that could stand against the sound of that clang echoing off the ridgelines. Colonel Drummond turned and looked at him. Colonel Hessler, she said quietly. Her voice did not carry. This was between the two of them. You told me in my office that this shot was impossible. You told me no one could make it. You told everyone that. She paused. And that candidate, the one you tried to have removed on medical grounds the day before qualification, just made it on her first attempt. She let that sit for a long, terrible moment. I'd like you to think very carefully about what that means, about what it means for everything else you've told me and everything else in that log. Brock Hessler did not say anything. He could not. His mouth had gone dry and his mind had gone blank, and there was nothing in him, no rank, no experience, no authority that could answer what she had just said. Report to my office at 1400, Drummond said. Bring the log, all of it. We're going to go through it together, page by page, and you're going to explain to me every single decision you made regarding Sergeant Thorne from the day she arrived. She looked back across the valley at the swinging plate. And I think we both already know how that conversation is going to go. And she walked away toward Elise, leaving Brock Hessler standing alone at the firing line with the wreckage of his entire life scattered around his feet. That was 10:47 in the morning. Colonel Drummond crossed the firing line to where Elise sat, still shaking Webb's hand, still on her shoulder. And the candidates parted for her, went quiet for her, and she came and stood in front of Elise. And Elise started to get to her feet to come to attention, and Drummond said, "As you were, Sergeant. Stay where you are. You've earned the right to sit down." Elise looked up at her. "That was the finest piece of marksmanship I have ever witnessed," Colonel Drummond said. "In 30 years in this army, and I have witnessed a great deal." She paused. "I want to confirm the shot officially right now in front of these witnesses. Observers, do you confirm a first-round impact on target 17 by Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne?" "Confirm, ma'am," the senior observer said. "First round, center plate, no question about it. We all saw it, we all heard it." "Then let the record show," Colonel Drummond said. And she raised her voice now so that the whole firing line could hear her, so that every candidate and every member of the cadre would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. That on this day, for the first time in the 40-year history of this course, target 17 has been struck. On the first attempt by Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne, let it be entered into the official record. The myth is broken. It's done. And the firing line erupted again, and this time Elise let herself be pulled up onto her feet by Webb and by Caldwell and by a dozen hands, and she stood there swaying in the middle of all of it, overwhelmed, and the candidates who had once looked at her like a problem now looked at her like a legend. And somewhere in the chaos, she found herself laughing and crying at the same time, the way you do when something too big to hold has finally impossibly come true. But Elise Thorne was not a person who forgot things. And in the middle of all that noise and joy, she looked across the firing line, and she found Brock Hessler standing alone. And something in her went quiet. Because here is the thing about Elise Thorne, the thing her father had taught her, the thing that made her who she was. She was the second kind of shooter. Not the kind who shoots to prove she's better than everybody else. The kind who shoots because somewhere out there is a person who's going to need her to be steady when everything's falling apart. And looking at Brock Hessler standing alone at the firing line, white-faced destroyed, watching his whole life come apart, she did not feel triumph. She felt something that surprised her. She felt mercy. She broke away from the crowd and she walked across the firing line, past Colonel Drummond, past the observers, past all of it. And she walked up to Colonel Brock Hessler and she stopped in front of him and she came to attention and she saluted him. The whole firing line went silent again because nobody understood it. The woman he had spent weeks trying to destroy had just beaten him more completely than any person had ever been beaten. And instead of savoring it, instead of turning her back on him, instead of letting him drown in it, she had walked across the range and rendered him the courtesy of a salute. Hessler stared at her. He did not return the salute. He couldn't. His arm would not move. "Sergeant," he said finally, and his voice was a ruin. "What are you doing?" "Rendering a salute to a superior officer, sir," Elise said. She held it. "As required." "After everything He stopped. He could not even say it. "You know what I did. You know all of it. The rifle, the routes, the lie in the field. You know I tried to have you removed yesterday. You know I tried to end your career." His voice shook. "And you're saluting me?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" And Elise Thorne lowered her salute, and she looked at Brock Hessler, this man who had tried so hard to break her, and she said something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, that would follow him into his quietest hours for years to come. Because my father spent 40 years hating the men who kept him out, sir, she said quietly. 40 years. And it hollowed him out. It made him bitter and small, and it stole every good thing he ever built one day at a time, until there was almost nothing left of him but the anger. And I watched it kill him, slowly, from the inside. She held his gaze steady, unflinching. I made myself a promise, sir, a long time ago, that I would never become that. That I would never let another person's cruelty turn me into something ugly. And you tried very hard to make me hate you, sir. You tried harder than anyone ever has. And I won't do it, not because you deserve mercy, maybe you don't, but because I deserve to be free of the poison that killed my father, and hating you would be letting you put that poison in me. She squared her shoulders. So I'm saluting you, sir, because you're a superior officer and the salute is the uniform's not yours. And because it's the last thing you expected, and I think somewhere under all of it, it might be the thing you most need to see. That a person can be treated the way you treated me and come out the other side without hate. That's not for you, sir. That's for me, and it's for my father. And it's the proof that you didn't win, not because you failed to break my shooting, because you failed to break my heart. And she turned and she walked away, and she left Brock Hessler standing at the firing line with tears in his eyes that he would deny for the rest of his life. That was 10:52 in the morning. He never fully admitted defeat. That was not in him. Men like Brock Hessler do not stand up and say out loud, I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I did a terrible thing. The machinery of his pride was too old and too deep for that. But in the days that followed, something in him changed quietly, the way a hard freeze finally breaks in the spring, invisibly at first and then all at once. At 1400 that day, he reported to Colonel Drummond's office with the log, and they went through it page by page, and he did not lie. That was the first thing. He did not lie. When she asked him why Sergeant Thorne had been assigned the northern approach, he did not invent a reason. He said, because I wanted her to fail, ma'am. When she asked him about the firing lanes and the time slots and the equipment issue on the first day, he answered each time with the truth. And the truth was ugly, and he laid it out on the desk between them without flinching, because he had finally understood that the lying was worse than the thing itself, and that a man who lies about his cruelty is twice as small as a man who owns it. Why are you telling me the truth now? Drummond asked him at one point. You could have kept lying. Some of this I couldn't have proven. And Brock Hessler was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, because she saluted me, ma'am. Drummond waited. After everything I did to her, Hessler said, and his voice was not steady. After I tried to end her twice, 3 times. She walked across that range, and she saluted me. And she told me she wouldn't hate me. Not because I deserved it, because she deserved to be free of it. He looked down at the log on the desk. I have spent 22 years, ma'am, believing that hardness was strength, that the way you build soldiers is you break them and see who puts themselves back together. That mercy is weakness and doubt is failure, and the only thing that matters is whether you can take the pain. He was quiet for a moment, and then a woman I tried to destroy showed me more strength in a single salute than I've shown in my entire career, and I understood standing there that I had it backwards. All of it. My whole life. The hardest thing in the world isn't breaking people. It's what she did. Refusing to become cruel when cruelty was the easy thing. He looked up at Drummond. I can't lie to you after that, ma'am. I don't have it in me anymore. She took it out of me. So no, I won't lie. Ask me anything, I'll tell you the truth. It's the only thing I've got left that's worth anything. Colonel Drummond looked at him for a long time. There will be consequences, Colonel, she said. You understand that. What you did can't be undone and it can't be ignored. There's a record and it's real and it doesn't match what you told me, and that has to be answered for. I know, ma'am. But I'll note for whatever it's worth that you told the truth today when you didn't have to. She closed the log. That matters. Not enough to save your command, but it matters. It's a start. And that was the closest Brock Hessler ever came to redemption. Not a grand confession, not a dramatic apology, just a hard man in a quiet office finally telling the truth about himself, because a woman he had tried to break had shown him what strength actually looked like, and he could no longer stand to be the small thing he had been. Meanwhile, the story moved. It moved the way the story of Sector 9 had moved, only faster and further, because this was bigger. By that evening, everyone at Fort Benning knew. By the next day, it had spread beyond the base, carried in phone calls and messages, and the quiet, excited voices of soldiers telling other soldiers about the thing they had seen. The female sniper who hit target 17. First round. 40 years of impossible broken in a single morning. And the colonel who swore it couldn't be done, who swore she couldn't do it, standing there white-faced while she did it. And there was another part of the story, too. The part that people told last in lowered voices. The part that made the whole thing more than just a marksmanship record. The part about the salute, about the woman who beat the man who tried to destroy her, and then in the moment of her greatest triumph, walked across the range and rendered him the courtesy he had never once shown her. That part traveled slower because it was harder to understand, but it traveled further, because once people understood it, they never forgot it. Caldwell found her that evening sitting alone outside the barracks. "Sergeant," he said, "can I sit?" "Course you can, Private." He sat down beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. And then Caldwell said, "I keep thinking about what you did today. Not the shot. I mean, the shot was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life. But that's not what I keep thinking about." He turned to look at her. "I keep thinking about the salute. You had him, Sergeant. You had him completely. He was destroyed. Everybody saw it. You could have walked away and let him drown in it, and nobody in the world would have blamed you. And instead, you saluted him." He shook his head. "I don't think I could have done that. I don't think one person in 100 could have done that. How did you do it?" Elise was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something, Private? Something I've never told anybody?" "Yeah, of course." "The night my father died," she said, "he was in and out of it at the end. The medication, the pain, he'd surface for a minute, and then he'd go back under. And in one of those minutes, near the very end, he grabbed my hand hard, harder than a dying man should have been able to, and he pulled me down close and he said something to me." She looked out into the dark. "He said, 'Don't do what I did.' He said, 'I spent my whole life hating the men who kept me out, and it ate everything. And now I'm dying, and all that hate's dying with me, and it never did one thing but poison the years I had. Don't do what I did, Elise. Whatever the world does to you, don't let it make you hard. Stay soft where it counts. That's the real strength. Anybody can get hard. It takes everything you've got to stay soft." Her voice caught. "Those were almost the last real words he ever said to me, Private. Don't let it make you hard. Stay soft where it counts." She wiped her eyes. "So when I was standing there looking at Hessler with everybody watching and every part of me wanting to turn my back on him and let him drown, I heard my father's voice. Don't let it make you hard. And I understood that if I walked away and let myself hate him, I'd be breaking the last promise I ever made to my father. And I don't break promises, Private, not ever, especially not that one." She looked at Caldwell. "So I saluted him. For my father, because staying soft where it counts, when the whole world is telling you to go hard, that's the shot my father really wanted me to make. The one across the valley was for what he could have been. The salute was for who he actually was underneath all that anger. A good man who just wanted better for me than he got for himself." Caldwell did not say anything for a long time. "Your father," he said finally, "must have been an incredible man." "He was," Elise said softly. "The world just never got to see it. Until today." She smiled, and it was sad, and it was proud, and it was free, all at once, until today. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and recognition and quiet, enormous change. The shot was entered into the official record permanently, the first confirmed impact on Target 17 in the history of the course. Elise's overall scores, the Sector 9, record the perfect qualification. The impossible shot added up to the highest final standing anyone had ever achieved. She would graduate at the very top of her class. It was not close. It had never been close once the sabotage and the manipulation were stripped away and only the shooting remained. Colonel Drummond made sure of that. She reviewed the entire course record personally, and where Hessler's manipulations had unfairly cost Elise points or standing, she corrected them one by one until the record reflected not the course Hessler had tried to run against her, but the course she had actually shot. And when it was done, the numbers were staggering, and there was no colonel left to argue with them. Brock Hessler was relieved of his command of the course. It was done quietly without spectacle, because the Army does not air its ugliest business in public if it can avoid it. But it was done. The man who had run that course, who had ruled it like a small kingdom for years, who had broken candidate after candidate and called it training, was gone. And the log Webb's log and Drummond's review, and the statements from the candidates and the cadre and the honest observer in the North Tower, all of it went into a file that would follow Brock Hessler for whatever remained of his career. He deserved worse, some said. He deserved to be thrown out entirely. But Elise, when she was asked, would not say it. "That's not for me to decide," she said. "I made my shot. I made my salute. The rest is between him and the Army and his own conscience. I've got no more room in me for what happens to Brock Hessler. I used all the room I had on that salute, and it's the best thing I ever did with it, and I'm not going to spoil it now by wishing him ill." And Marcus Webb, who had watched all of it from the sabotaged rifle on the first day to the salute at the firing line, made one final entry in the private notebook he had kept the whole way through. He had shown parts of it to Drummond, the parts that mattered for the record, but the last entry he made was not for any record. It was just for himself. He wrote, "I have been in this Army for 22 years, and I thought I knew what a soldier was. I was wrong. A soldier is not the hardest person in the room. A soldier is the one who stays who they are when everything is trying to make them into something else. Today I watched a woman make a shot that will be told about for 100 years, and then I watched her do something harder than the shot. I watched her refuse to hate the man who tried to destroy her. I don't know if I'll ever be that strong, but I know now what to reach for. Her father taught her, and she taught me, and that's how it's supposed to work. That's what the uniform is actually for, not to make us hard, to make us worthy of the trust other people put in us. Old Man Thorne, the ghost of the high country, you never wore this uniform, but your daughter did today, and she wore it better than anyone I've ever seen. Wherever you are, sir, you should know. She made your shot. And then she made a better one. Rest easy. She turned out exactly right." He closed the notebook. And outside in the last of the evening light, Elise Thorne sat alone on the steps of the barracks with her father's worn notebook in her hands, and she was not crying anymore, and she was not shaking anymore in the enormous weight she had carried all these weeks. The legacy and the grief and the promise had shifted into something else. Not gone, it would never be gone, but changed, lighter. Because she had carried it all the way to the end, across an impossible valley, and she had set it down at last exactly where it belonged. She opened the notebook to the last page one more time. "Become the sniper I never could be, and then become something more than that, become you." "I did, Daddy," she whispered. "I became the sniper you never could be, and then today I think I finally became me." She closed the notebook and held it to her chest. "And you were there. I felt you, right behind me, calling my wind the whole way. You were always there. You always will be." And she sat there in the fading light, a qualified sniper in the United States Army, top of her class, the woman who broke the impossible, the daughter of the ghost of the high country, and for the first time in 8 long months, she felt at peace. Graduation day came 2 weeks later, and it was nothing like the first morning. On the first morning, Elise Thorne had stood in the mud in the rain, while a colonel tore her qualification sheet in half and told her she would quit. On graduation day, she stood in a clean uniform in the bright sun, and the whole course stood with her, and there was not a single person in that formation who did not know exactly what she had done and exactly what it had cost her to do it. Colonel Patricia Drummond presided. She had insisted on it personally, and when it came time to recognize the top graduate of the class, she did not just read the name off a card and hand over a certificate. She set the card down and she looked out at the assembled candidates and cadre and the families who had come to watch. And she spoke from somewhere deeper than protocol. 40 years, she said. For 40 years, this course has had a target that no one could hit. Target 17. It became more than a target. It became a story we told to explain the limits of what was possible. Every shooter who came through here fired at it and missed, and every miss added to the legend until we all quietly agreed without ever saying it out loud that some things simply cannot be done. She paused. And then 2 weeks ago, a candidate stepped up to that firing line, and on her first attempt, she hit it. And in doing so, she taught every one of us a lesson that has nothing to do with marksmanship. She found Elise in the formation. She taught us that impossible is not a fact. Impossible is just a word we use for the things no one has been patient enough or skilled enough, or brave enough to do yet. It is a boundary, and boundaries exist to be crossed by the people who refuse to accept them. The formation was utterly silent. But that is not the reason I asked to be here today, Colonel Drummond went on. I have seen good shooters before. I have seen records broken. What I had never seen in 30 years in this army was what this candidate did after she made her shot. Her voice grew quieter, and somehow that made everyone lean in. In the moment of her greatest triumph, with every reason in the world to do otherwise, she chose mercy. She chose grace. She chose to be at the highest moment of her life, exactly the person she had always been, and not the person that cruelty might have turned her into. And I want every soldier standing here today to understand something. That choice was harder than the shot. That choice took more strength than a mile of impossible wind. Because anyone given enough talent and enough training might one day make a shot like that. But almost no one given the chance to hate chooses grace instead. She straightened. That is the soldier we are graduating at the top of this class today. Not just the finest marksman this course has produced in 40 years. The finest person, Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne, front and center. And Elise walked forward through the silent formation, and she came to attention in front of Colonel Drummond, and Drummond pinned the qualification badge to her chest with her own hands. Sergeant Thorne, she said quietly, just for the two of them, you are a qualified sniper in the United States Army. Top of your class. It's official. It's permanent. No one can ever take it from you. She stepped back and saluted her. It has been the honor of my career to sign my name to your record. And Elise returned the salute, and her eyes were bright, and somewhere behind her, the whole formation began to applaud, and it built and built until it was a roar. And Caldwell was somewhere in it shouting her name. And Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the field with his arms folded, and a look on his weathered face that no one had ever seen there before. Something soft, something proud, something close to peace. That was graduation day. But the story was not quite over, because there was one more thing that Elise had to do. One more promise to keep, and it was the most important one of all. That evening after the ceremony, after the photographs, in the congratulations, in the handshakes from officers who had never spoken to her before, Elise slipped away from all of it, and she went and found a quiet place at the edge of the base where she could be alone, and she took out her phone and she made a call she had been putting off for 8 months. She called her mother. Her mother, who still lived in the cabin in Montana on the northern face of the mountain alone, now in the house where Elise had grown up, in the house where her father had died. Her mother, who had buried a husband 8 months ago and had watched her daughter leave for a course that everyone said a woman couldn't finish, and had spent every day since praying and worrying and waiting for news. Mom, Elise said when her mother answered. It's me. Elise? Her mother's voice was tight with fear, because a call after dark from a base far away could mean anything, could mean the worst thing. Elise, what is it? What happened? Are you all right? I'm all right, Mom. Elise had to stop for a moment because her throat had closed up. I'm better than all right. Mom, I did it. I graduated. Top of my class. I'm a qualified sniper. It's done. It's official. There was a long silence on the line, and then Elise heard her mother begin to cry quietly 3,000 miles away in the cabin on the mountain. Oh, Elise, her mother said. Oh, honey, your father. She could not finish it. Mom, Elise said, there's more. There's something I have to tell you, and I need you to sit down because it's a lot. And she told her. She told her about Target 17, about the 40 years, about the impossible valley and the wind no one could read, and the hundreds of shooters who had failed. And she told her about the shot, about lying behind the rifle for 4 minutes, reading the wind, waiting for the window her father had taught her to wait for, about feeling him there right at the end, right behind her, calling her wind exactly the way he'd promised in the last words he ever wrote. I hit it, Mom, she said, and now she was crying too. First round, I hit the target that no one's hit in 40 years. And Mom, I know it wasn't just me. I felt him. I felt Daddy right behind me the whole time. It was his shot. Everything he taught me, everything he was, it went across that valley and it hit that target, and Mom, it proved it. It proved he was exactly what he always believed he was. The world never let him show it, but I showed it for him. 40 years he spent thinking he wasn't good enough. And Mom, that shot proved he was better than anyone this army ever produced. His shot, his knowledge, his hands through mine. Her mother was sobbing now openly, And through the sobs, she said, he knew. Elise, he knew you'd do it. Do you know what he said at the end, the last week? He said, my girl's going to do the thing I never could. She's going to walk into a place full of men who'll tell her she can't, and she's going to do the impossible, and she's going to do it for both of us. He said that. He knew. He always knew. Her mother's voice broke completely. He believed in you when he couldn't believe in himself. That was the one thing the anger never touched. His faith in you. It was the last good thing left in him, and it was the strongest thing in him. And Elise, you just proved him right about the only thing he was ever sure of. Elise pressed the phone to her ear and cried into the dark 3,000 miles from home, and she had never felt her father closer than she did in that moment. There's one more thing, Mom, she said when she could speak again, the hardest part, and I think it's the part Daddy would have been proudest of. And she told her about Hessler, about what he'd done, all of it, the sabotaged rifle, and the stacked routes, and the lie in the field, and the folder built to destroy her. And her mother's crying turned angry the way a mother's does when she hears that the world tried to hurt her child. But Elise kept going. And Mom, she said, when I made the shot and everybody saw what he'd done, and he was standing there destroyed with his whole career coming apart in front of everyone, I had him, Mom. I could have turned my back on him and let him drown and no one would have blamed me. And instead I walked across that range and I saluted him. The line went quiet. You did what? Her mother whispered. I saluted him, Mom, because of what Daddy said to me. At the end, when he grabbed my hand and pulled me down close, Elise's voice shook. He said, don't do what I did. Don't let it make you hard. Stay soft where it counts. That's the real strength. And Mom, when I was standing there looking at Hessler, I heard Daddy's voice and I understood that if I let myself hate that man, I'd be breaking the last promise I ever made to Daddy. The promise to not become what the anger made him. So I saluted him instead. For Daddy, because staying soft when the whole world's telling you to go hard, that's the real shot he wanted me to make. Not the one across the valley. That one. She wiped her face. And Mom, I think I finally set Daddy free. Not just the shot, the salute. I think I finally broke the thing that killed him. The hate. I refused to carry it. I set it down. And I think wherever he is, I think he's finally free of it too. Her mother was silent for a long, long time. And then she said in a voice full of a grief and a pride too big to hold, Elise, your father spent 40 years a prisoner of that anger. And you just walked into the exact situation that made him a place full of men telling you that you didn't belong, a man doing everything he could to break you, and you refused to become what he became. You broke the chain, honey. Do you understand what you did? For 4 decades, that bitterness ran through this family like poison, and you just stopped it. You reached across that firing line, and you saluted the man who tried to destroy you, and in that one moment you broke 40 years of poison, and you set your father free, and you set yourself free, and you set our whole family free. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. That's the real record you broke today, Elise. Not the target, the chain. You broke the chain. And Elise Thorne, standing alone in the dark at the edge of a base 3,000 miles from home, understood for the first time the full size of what she had done. She had thought the shot was the thing. The impossible shot, 40 years unbeaten, broken on the first attempt. But her mother was right. The shot was never the thing. The shot was just the door. What she had actually done, the real impossible thing, was refuse to let a lifetime of cruelty turn her into a cruel person. She had taken everything her father's bitterness had done to their family, and she had ended it in a single salute in the moment when hate would have been so easy and so justified. She had become the sniper her father never could be, and then she had become something more than that. She had become herself, and in becoming herself, she had finally freed him. Elise went home to Montana on leave before her first assignment. She flew into the little regional airport and drove the long road up the mountain in a rented truck past the feed store, where old men still talked about the ghost of the high country, up the switchbacks to the cabin on the northern face where she had grown up, where her mother waited on the porch. Older now, grayer now, but standing tall. They held each other for a long time without speaking. And then Elise did the thing she had come home to do. She took her father's rifle, the old one, the one he had taught her on, the one that had shot at paper and steel for 40 years and never once at anything that mattered. And she took her mother, and together they hiked up to the high meadow above the cabin, the place where her father had trained her 10,000 times, the place where he had taught her to read the wind and be patient and become the guidance system. And there in the high meadow where it had all begun, Elise Thorne set up her father's rifle, and she looked out across the valley below, and she read the wind the way he had taught her, and she took a shot. Not at any target, just out across the valley he had loved into the wind he had spent his whole life reading. One shot rolling out across the mountains, echoing off the peaks, a sound he had made 10,000 times in that exact spot. "That one was yours, Daddy," she said quietly as the echo faded. "That one was all yours." Her mother took her hand. "He's here," her mother said. "You know that, don't you? He's here. He was always going to be here. This mountain, this meadow, this is where he was most himself. He's here, and he saw the whole thing. And Elise, he's not angry anymore. I can feel it. For the first time since he died, I can feel it. He's not angry anymore. You did that. You set him down easy at last." And Elise stood in the high meadow with her father's rifle in her hands and her mother's hand in hers, and she felt it too. The peace, the stillness, the particular deep quiet that comes to a mountain after a long storm has finally passed. The anger that had ruled her father for 40 years, the bitterness that had killed him slowly from the inside, the poison that had threatened to run down through her too, it was gone. She had carried it up the mountain, and she had set it down, and she had let it go, and in its place was something clean and whole and free. She was no longer just her father's student. She had proven everything he taught her was real. And in proving it, she had graduated from being the vessel of his knowledge to being a master of it in her own right. She was no longer defined by doubt. The colonel who tried to break her, the men who said she didn't belong, the whole weight of everyone who expected her to fail, all of it had been answered permanently with a single impossible shot and a single impossible salute. And there was nothing left for the doubt to hold on to. And she was no longer haunted by her father's unfinished life, because she had finished it for him. She had taken his shot, the one he dreamed of his whole life, and she had made it. And she had done the thing he begged her to do, with his dying breath, the thing he himself never managed. She had stayed soft where it counts. She had refused to let the world make her hard. She had broken the chain. They hiked back down the mountain as the sun was setting. The daughter and the mother and the old rifle rode easy on Elise's shoulder, and for the first time in 8 months, for the first time really, in her whole life, Elise Thorne felt entirely, completely at peace with who she was. Because here is the truth that Elise Thorne carried down that mountain, the truth that her father spent 40 years trying to learn and never quite could, the truth she finally understood all the way to the bottom of her soul. Impossible is only a word. It is only ever a boundary, and a boundary is only ever a line drawn by people who stopped trying, and a line drawn by people who stopped trying means nothing at all to the person who refuses to stop. Her father's whole tragedy was that he had believed the world when it told him he wasn't good enough, and he had let that lie become the boundary of his entire life. And Elise had refused to believe it. She had refused to accept the boundary of the impossible shot, and she had crossed it. And she had refused to accept the boundary of hate, the easy road that cruelty had paved for her, and she had crossed that one too, which was harder and which mattered more. The girl who arrived at Fort Benning had come to keep a promise to a dead man. The woman who left had done something greater. She had kept the promise, yes. She had become the sniper her father never could be. But she had also become the thing he most needed her to be and could never be himself. She had become free. And she had reached back through 40 years of family history and set him free along with her. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne went on to a long and quiet and distinguished career, and she was everyone who ever served with her agreed the second kind of shooter, the kind who was steady when everything was falling apart, the kind you wanted on the mountain with you when the sun went down. She never bragged about Target 17. She rarely mentioned it at all. When young soldiers who had heard the legend asked her about the impossible shot, she would tell them the same thing every time. The thing her father had taught her, the thing that was truer than any record. The shot was never the hard part, she would say. The hard part is staying who you are when everything's trying to make you into something else. Anybody can learn to read the wind. The real test is what's in your heart when the world hands you every reason to let it turn ugly. Make that shot. Make the one that keeps you soft where it counts. That's the only impossible worth breaking. And somewhere in Montana, on the northern face of a mountain in a high meadow, where the wind comes down off the peaks like a living thing, The ghost of the high country rests easy at last, no longer angry, no longer wanting, no longer waiting for a world that never came through for him. Because his daughter came through. His daughter took his shot and made it, and took his pain, and healed it, and took his last impossible wish, and made it real. She became the sniper he never could be. And then she became something more than that. She became herself. And that in the end was the shot that no one believed possible, and the shot that mattered most, and the shot that Elise Thorne, daughter of the ghost of the high country keeper of every promise she ever made, hit dead center on the very first try.